desperate plea echoed across the dust-choked plains, a whisper of survival that challenged the brittle fabric of an unforgiving world. What could compel a woman, hardened by loss and stained by choices made in shadows, to open not just her door, but her very essence to a stranger's child? It was a question whispered by the wind, carried on the scent of dry earth and burgeoning fear, as a man, a lonely figure etched against the vast, indifferent sky, approached her isolated cabin. He came begging, a silent prayer etched on his face, for the milk that might save his child, unaware that the woman he sought was herself a creature of complex contradictions, her compassion as fierce as it was unexpected, and her heart a landscape of both desolation and surprising wells of defiant grace. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. Ilara's world was a small, dusty square of existence, defined by the sagging walls of her cabin and the relentless, searing sun. Days bled into one another, marked only by the shifting angles of light on the wooden floor and the dull ache in her bones, a constant reminder of the life she'd carved out, or perhaps that had carved itself out of her. Her hands, calloused and strong, bore the scars of endless toil, yet they held a surprising delicacy when she touched the worn fabric of her apron, or traced the faded patterns on a chipped ceramic mug. Loneliness was a companion she knew well, a silent shadow that lengthened with the setting sun, but it was a loneliness she had chosen, or so she told herself. It kept the world out, with its judging eyes and whispered condemnations, its expectations and its cruel, quick judgments. She was a woman of sharp angles and guarded eyes, her beauty a forgotten bloom, now withered by the harsh realities of her existence. When the silhouette appeared on the horizon, wavering like a mirage in the heat haze, a flicker of something ancient and primal stirred within her, a ripple in the stagnant pond of her solitary peace. It wasn't curiosity that drew her to the window, but a deeper, more unsettling instinct, a premonition that the quiet order of her days was about to shatter, irrevocably, into a million scattered pieces. The man walked with a weary gait, his shoulders hunched not just against the sun, but against the weight of an invisible burden, a testament to struggles untold and sorrows too heavy to carry alone. He moved with a quiet desperation, each step a testament to an exhaustion that went beyond the physical, an exhaustion of the spirit. He was a black man in a white world, and his very presence on her land, on this desolate edge of nowhere, was a challenge, a question thrown into the face of unspoken rules. He stood at her threshold, a shadow against the blazing afternoon, his plea a hoarse whisper that scraped against the silence. "Milk," he managed, his voice thick with desperation. "My child." Fevered, gone days without. His eyes, sunken and bloodshot, held a torment that Ilara recognized, a mirroring of a pain she knew intimately. It was the raw, unvarnished fear of helplessness, the terror that grips a parent when their child teeters on the edge of oblivion. Her own hands twitched, an old phantom ache echoing in her phantom womb. The child, wrapped in a thin, tattered shawl, was a tiny, fragile bundle, impossibly small, a bird with broken wings. Its breath was shallow, ragged, each gasp a desperate snatch at life, a faint cry that pierced the thick armor of Ilara's self-imposed isolation. She saw the dust on its tiny, fevered brow, the faint tremor of its limbs, and something in her snapped. Not a crack of weakness, but a violent surge of an instinct long buried, a defiant rejection of the stoic indifference she had cultivated. This was not about him, not about the unspoken lines of color or station that divided their world. This was about a breath, a flickering spark of life poised to extinguish. Without a word, she reached out, her fingers brushing the man's calloused hand as she took the child. The touch was brief, electric, a jolt of shared humanity in the vast, empty space. She turned, her back to the bewildered man, and moved with purpose towards the worn wooden chair by the window, the soft light illuminating the desperation in her eyes. The choice was not a choice at all. It was an imperative, a primal scream against the finality of death. The child, when she unwrapped the ragged cloth, was pitifully small, its skin hot and dry to the touch, its tiny mouth making weak, suckling motions. A profound silence descended upon the cabin, broken only by the child's shallow breathing and the frantic thumping of Alara's own heart. The air itself seemed to hum with unspoken tension, a fragile bridge between two strangers, two desperate souls. Her mind, usually a fortress of hardened resolve, spun back, not to her own lost child, but to a different memory, a different shame, a memory of a choice made, a life denied, a whisper of a secret that clung to her like the dust on the floorboards. Was this a penance? A desperate attempt to absolve herself of a past that haunted her waking hours and twisted her dreams? The man, still standing by the door, was a statue of weary hope, his eyes fixed on the scene with an intensity that spoke volumes. He did not move, did not speak, simply watched, his fate and that of his child, suspended in this charged moment. With a quiet sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years, Alara unbuttoned her dress, exposing the pale curve of her breast. The act was raw, unthinking, a purely maternal response that transcended social convention, transcended the very notion of stranger. The infant, guided by an instinct more ancient than fear, found her nipple, and a soft, hungry suckling began. A wave of sensation, alien and yet profoundly familiar, washed over Alara. It was not just the physical pull, but a flood of emotion, a fierce protectiveness, a surprising tenderness, and a deep, unexpected sorrow for the child, for the man, and for the world that had brought them to this stark precipice. In that moment, the dust, the heat, the harshness of their lives all receded, leaving only the sound of a tiny, desperate life finding its fragile sustenance. It was an act of profound vulnerability and immense strength, a silent rebellion against a world that had taught them both to guard their hearts. Days blurred into a strange, tenuous rhythm. The child, unnamed to Alara, began to gain a fragile strength, its cries growing more robust, its eyes, when open, holding a milky curiosity. The man, Elias, as she soon learned, would come each morning, his worn hat held respectfully in his hands, his gaze a mixture of gratitude and an almost unbearable awkwardness. He offered what he could, a handful of wild berries, a small gnarled piece of wood he'd carved into a crude bird, meager tokens of his immense appreciation. Their conversations were sparse, marked by long silences that held more meaning than any words. He spoke of his homestead, a desolate patch of land miles away, of the harshness of the soil, of his wife, gone to the fever, leaving him with only the babe and the unforgiving earth. Alara would listen, her gaze often fixed on a distant point beyond the window, her mind grappling with the burgeoning complexity of their connection. It was an arrangement born of necessity, yet it began to weave itself into the very fabric of her isolated life, a thread of human contact that was both comforting and terrifying. She watched him, this quiet, resilient man, his dignity unbent by his desperate circumstances, and a grudging respect began to bloom in the barren landscape of her heart. But the world outside their cabin was not as silent, nor as understanding. Mrs. Albright, whose sprawling ranch bordered Alara's meager patch, had begun to make her weekly visits to the general store a theatrical event, her eyes, sharp as flint, darting towards Alara's distant cabin. She would linger by the dusty counter, her voice pitched just loud enough for others to hear, speaking of unchristian alliances and the mixing of blood, her words like venomous barbs aimed squarely at the fragile peace Alara was forging. Old Man Hemlock, a widower with a perpetual scowl, would tip his hat to Alara with an exaggerated slowness, his gaze lingering with an unsettling curiosity. The air thickened with suspicion, a palpable pressure that pressed down on Alara, reminding her of the societal chains she had always tried to outrun. Their judgment was a constant hum, a background noise to the fragile symphony of survival playing out within her walls. One searing afternoon, as the sun baked the earth to a brittle crisp, Elias found Alara mending a torn canvas, her needle glinting in the faint light. The child, restless, stirred beside her. He spoke, his voice low, almost a confession. "My boy," he began, then hesitated, his gaze drifting towards the small empty cradle by the wall, a relic Alara hadn't had the heart to dismantle. His mother, she was a good woman, strong, but the fever, it took her quick. His voice cracked, a raw wound exposed. We'd been here on this land for 2 seasons, tried to make a life. For him. He gestured vaguely towards the sleeping infant. A tremor passed through Alara. She saw his pain, unvarnished and deep, and something in its familiarity stirred a long-buried memory within her, a shard of her own past, sharp and unyielding. It was the winter of 78, the snow a shroud over everything, the cold an insidious thief. Her own child, small and frail, its breath a feather against her cheek, had slipped away silently in the night. No fever, no struggle, just a quiet cessation of life, a stillness that had ripped the world from under her feet. But it was not just the death that haunted her, but the unspoken truth of its conception. The father, a drifter, had ridden away with the spring thaw, leaving her with a swelling belly and the merciless judgment of the town. She had been young, desperate, and alone, ostracized, whispered about, marked. She had carried the burden of that child, and its quiet passing, like a brand on her soul. This grief, this profound, inescapable grief that Elias carried, was a mirror, reflecting her own, but with a crucial difference. His sorrow was public, mourned, while hers was a secret, a private wound festering beneath layers of carefully constructed indifference. This shared valley of sorrow, however, was also a precipice. It laid bare the hypocrisy of a world that judged her for the circumstances of her loss, while offering sympathy to him. The land, once her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its boundaries tightening around her. She looked at Elias, then at the child, a fragile bridge between their 2 desolate worlds, and a question, sharp and unwelcome, sliced through her. Could this fragile connection, born of such desperate need, ever truly be safe in a world so quick to condemn, so eager to divide? The unspoken tension in the air became a living thing, a palpable presence that pressed down on the cabin. Elias's visits, once hushed and almost furtive, grew bolder, his presence longer. The child, now named Caleb, would gurgle and grasp at Alara's fingers, his small hand a tether to a world she had long abandoned. Alara found herself anticipating Elias's arrival, the quiet rhythm of her days disrupted by a strange sense of expectation. She began to mend his worn shirts, to boil herbs for Caleb's persistent cough, to share the meager food she cultivated. It was an unspoken alliance, a quiet defiance of the world's rigid boundaries. But the world, in its cruel wisdom, would not be ignored. The whispers of Mrs. Albright had blossomed into outright accusations. She had taken to riding past Alara's property, her face a mask of righteous indignation, her buggy kicking up dust that seemed to mock the fragile peace within the cabin. Others, emboldened by her condemnation, began to follow suit. A stone had been thrown at her window one night, shattering the stillness, leaving a jagged crack in the glass, a physical manifestation of the growing hostility. Alara, her shotgun clutched in her hands, had stood vigil until dawn, her heart a cold, hard knot of fear and fury. Elias, sensing the escalating danger, began to bring more than just gratitude. He brought a rough-hewn fence post one day, then a handful of salvaged wire, a silent promise of protection, a desperate attempt to fortify their fragile sanctuary. "They won't understand," he murmured one evening, his eyes fixed on the distant lights of the town. "They see difference, and they fear it." His words were heavy with an age-old weariness, the burden of a history that relentlessly repeated itself. Alara knew. She understood the fear, the ingrained prejudice that saw anything outside its narrow bounds as a threat. Her own past, her own transgressions, had taught her the bitter taste of ostracism. They were 2 outcasts, bound by an infant's desperate need, drawing the gaze of a society determined to maintain its order, even if that order meant crushing the lives of those who dared to defy its silent, unforgiving laws. The air thrummed with a dangerous anticipation, a storm gathering on the horizon, threatening to break over their small, defiant haven. The storm, when it broke, came not with thunder and lightning, but with the clatter of hooves and the harsh shouts of men. It was Mrs. Albright who led them, her face contorted with a mixture of self-righteous fury and a chilling certainty of her own moral superiority. A posse, a dozen strong, their faces grim, Their voices raised in a chorus of condemnation, rode towards Ilara's cabin, their purpose starkly clear. They spoke of protecting the community, of decency and order, their words a thinly veiled cloak for the deep-seated prejudice that fueled their anger. Elias, who had been helping Ilara reinforce the rickety fence, straightened slowly, his eyes narrowing. Caleb, inside, startled by the sudden commotion, began to wail, a sharp, piercing sound that cut through the escalating noise. "You harbor in that man!" Mrs. Albright shrieked, her voice shrill, pointing a trembling finger at Elias. "And that child, it's an abomination, a blight on this land." Ilara stepped forward, her body tense, a quiet defiance in her stance. Her hand went to the cold metal of the shotgun leaning against the door frame, its presence a stark declaration. "He's done no harm," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though a tremor ran through her veins, a cold fear intertwining with a burning indignation. "He's a father caring for his child." "Caring for his child with your milk?" sneered a burly man, his words laced with a sneering disgust, and the men behind him chuckled, a low, guttural sound that sent a chill down Ilara's spine. The implication hung heavy in the air, thick with their perverse assumptions, twisting her act of compassion into something ugly and sordid. It was an attack not just on Elias, but on her, on the very notion of her womanhood. This was the moment, the raw, ugly climax of their quiet defiance. Ilara felt a surge of cold fury, but also a strange, quiet clarity. She had fled judgment before, but this time she would stand. She would not let their small minds and their petty hatred destroy the fragile life she had helped to nurture. The choice was stark: crumble under their condemnation, or stand firm, a beacon of defiance in a world determined to extinguish all light that dared to defy its darkness. The air crackled, thick with the scent of dust and malevolent intent. Ilara stood her ground, the shotgun a cold, familiar weight in her hands, her gaze unflinching as she met Mrs. Albright's venomous stare. Elias moved to stand beside her, his presence a quiet bulwark, his hand subtly resting on her arm, a silent pact of solidarity. Caleb's cries had subsided to whimpers, as if the child, too, sensed the perilous shift in the atmosphere. "This ain't your land to decide what happens on it," Ilara stated, her voice low, a surprising steel in its tone. "And it ain't your place to judge what kin I take in." The words hung in the charged air, a direct challenge to the self-appointed moral authority of the posse. A ripple went through the men, some shifting uneasily, perhaps seeing the raw truth in her defiance, others fueled by the righteous anger that had brought them there. Mrs. Albright, her face contorted with rage, screamed, "We'll see about that. This ain't natural. This ain't right." Her hand went to the bridle of her horse, ready to turn, to retreat, but not before she hurled one last, cutting remark, a poisoned arrow aimed at Ilara's deepest vulnerability. "You always were a woman of loose morals, Ilara. And now you're bringing that filth here. This child, this abomination, and it's a stain on all of us." The words, sharp and deliberate, sliced through Ilara's composure, striking at the very core of her past shame. Her hand tightened on the shotgun, her knuckles white. But then, as if from nowhere, Elias spoke, his voice surprisingly calm, cutting through the vitriol like a sharp blade. "My son is a blessing," he said, his eyes unwavering as he looked directly at Mrs. Albright. "And this woman, she has shown more kindness in a day than your whole town has in a lifetime." His quiet dignity, his refusal to be cowed, seemed to deflate some of the mob's bluster. They shuffled, muttered amongst themselves, the righteous anger giving way to an awkward uncertainty. The moment stretched, taut as a bowstring. Then, with a frustrated huff, Mrs. Albright wheeled her horse around, the rest of the posse following, their retreat a slow, grudging withdrawal, leaving behind only the stirred dust and the lingering stench of their hatred. The silence that followed was immense, heavy with the weight of the confrontation. Ilara lowered the shotgun, her shoulders slumping, the adrenaline draining from her. The cost of their defiance, she knew, would be steep. But in that moment, as she looked at Elias and the now quiet child in his arms, she felt a profound, unwavering certainty that it was a cost she was willing to bear. The posse retreated, leaving a bruised silence in their wake. But their departure was not a victory, merely a temporary reprieve. The air hummed with the unspoken threat of their return, a dark cloud clinging to the horizon. Ilara and Elias stood for a long moment, watching the dust settle. A shared exhaustion etched on their faces. The immediate danger had passed, but the deeper battle had only just begun. The crack in Ilara's window served as a constant reminder of the world's intolerance, a stark metaphor for the fragile state of their peace. Yet, in the aftermath of the confrontation, something had shifted, a bond forged in the crucible of shared adversity. The unspoken respect between them deepened, solidifying into a quiet understanding. Elias no longer came just for Caleb's feeding. He stayed, working the small patch of land around Ilara's cabin, tilling the stubborn earth, repairing the sagging roof, his silent labor a testament to his gratitude and a nascent hope. He brought back game from his hunts, meager but nourishing, and together they would share the evening meal. The silence between them no longer awkward but comfortable, a quiet language of shared survival. Ilara, in turn, found herself tending to his worn clothes, her fingers moving with a newfound tenderness, and a fragile sense of purpose began to unfurl within her. She was no longer just existing. She was nurturing, protecting, building something, however small and precarious, against the vast indifference of the world. Caleb, now a robust, laughing child, was the living embodiment of their unspoken pact, a tiny, vibrant pulse in the quiet heart of their home. His gurgles and joyful cries were a balm to their weary souls, a defiant song against the world's discord. The threat of the outside world, though ever present, now seemed distant, tempered by the warmth of their growing connection. They had found each other on the desolate edges of society, two lost souls bound by an act of unexpected compassion, and in the shadow of condemnation, a strange, resilient family began to take root, its foundation built not on blood, but on a shared defiance of a world that refused to see anything but their differences. The harshness of the land, once a reflection of Ilara's own barren heart, slowly began to yield under their combined efforts. Elias's calloused hands, accustomed to coaxing life from unwilling soil, worked alongside hers, turning the dust into something resembling fertile ground. They planted corn, beans, and hardy squash, their efforts a quiet rebellion against the certainty of scarcity. The cabin, once a solitary shell, now held the echoes of 3 lives, a nascent symphony of creaks and murmurs, the soft coo of Caleb, the low hum of Elias's infrequent songs, and Ilara's own quiet sighs, no longer laden with despair, but with a weary contentment. The unspoken fear of Mrs. Albright's return lingered, a phantom limb that throbbed with every distant hoofbeat, but it was overshadowed by the burgeoning life within their walls. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Elias found Ilara sitting on the porch, watching Caleb chase a firefly. He sat beside her, the silence between them comfortable, a tapestry woven from shared experiences and unspoken emotions. "My people," Elias began, his voice soft, reflective. "We always found strength in community, in family. When you lose that, it's like a piece of you goes missing." Ilara listened, her gaze fixed on the fading light. "Everyone loses something," she murmured, her voice rough, a confession she rarely allowed herself. "Some just lose more than others." She finally turned to him, her eyes, usually guarded, now holding a flicker of vulnerability. "I lost everything once. My standing, my child, my reason for being." The words, heavy with years of unspoken grief, hung in the air. "They called me names. Worse." He reached out, his hand covering hers, a gesture of profound empathy that transcended words. "You're a good woman, Ilara," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "You saved my son. You're building something here, and that counts for more than any names they can call." In that moment, something shifted deep within Ilara. His simple words, devoid of judgment, saturated with acceptance, were a balm to old wounds. It wasn't pity, but recognition, a profound understanding that she had not known she yearned for. She had given him milk for his child, sustenance for his body, but he in turn had given her something far more profound, a quiet affirmation, a sense of worth, and a fragile, burgeoning hope that the fractured pieces of her life might, after all, find a way to knit themselves back together into a whole, albeit scarred, new design. This connection, forged in desperation, deepened by shared trials, was becoming something powerful, something defiant in its quiet tenderness, offering a pathway toward a future she had never dared to dream. The seasons turned, and with each passing moon, the bond between Ilara, Elias, and Caleb wove itself tighter, a resilient tapestry against the fraying edges of a hostile world. The cabin, once a symbol of Ilara's isolation, had transformed into a haven, its rough walls echoing with the laughter of a child and the quiet rhythms of shared lives. Caleb, a sturdy toddler now, called Ilara Mama, a word that resonated deep within her, mending old wounds she hadn't known could heal. Elias, a man of quiet strength, was more than just a presence. He was a partner, his steady hand a comfort, his unwavering gaze a mirror reflecting a nascent hope she dared to embrace. They faced the daily struggles of homestead life together, the dry spells, the encroaching pests, the ever-present threat of a world that refused to forget their unconventional alliance. They heard the whispers in town, the snide remarks from those who still clung to their prejudices, but the collective strength they had forged within their small family shielded them, transforming the venomous words into distant, impotent buzzing. There was a quiet understanding that settled between Ilara and Elias, a silent agreement to face whatever came, hand in hand, heart to heart. Their relationship was not defined by grand pronouncements or passionate declarations, but by the shared weight of a child in their arms, the calloused touch of hands working the land, and the quiet comfort of presence in a world that had once left them both utterly alone. They were a family born not of societal convention, but of necessity, compassion, and a fierce, shared determination to defy the odds stacked against them. Ilara, once a woman defined by her flaws and her past, found a quiet strength she never knew she possessed, a deep well of resilience unearthed by the simple, profound act of giving. She had given him milk for his child, a gesture born of desperate humanity, but in return, she had received something far greater, a purpose, a future, and the undeniable, transformative power of a love that bloomed in the most unexpected and challenging of landscapes. The world outside might rage, but within the walls of their humble cabin, a new life, a new hope had taken root, sturdy and unyielding against the relentless winds of prejudice and despair.